Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a world of bubbling cauldrons, veiled figures, and the clink of wooden ladles echoing off damp stone walls. You're standing in the warm heart of a medieval convent, where the smell of toasted grain and lavender mead lingers in the air, and where, surprise, the best beer in the region might not be coming from monks at all. Imagine, outside the convent walls, townspeople are arguing over the latest tax, cattle are mooing like they've got an agenda, and the local monks are polishing their goblets for a feast. But inside here, a quiet revolution is fermenting, literally. Women in wimples are brewing complex ales with ingredients most men wouldn't even recognize. There's no marketing, no bearded hipsters in sandals, just nuns, brewing like their souls depended on it. And sometimes, it kinda did. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting a solemn prayer and pilgrimage story. This is about hops and holy mischief, yeast and gender politics, fermentation and feminist defiance, served warm in a clay cup with a pinch of coriander. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Always love seeing our sleepy little world map grow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a garden path, soft moss underfoot, guided by the buttery glow of a beeswax lantern. The cloister arches overhead, but instead of Gregorian chant, the hum of a nearby fire catches your ear. You follow it to a back building, a little too fragrant for a chapel, and definitely too steamy for a scriptorium. This is the convent brewery. Inside, the air is thick with malt and smoke. Copper kettles gurgle. A veiled woman stirs a mash tun with slow, deliberate grace. Another checks the thermometer. Not a fancy one, mind you, but a glass vial with floating herbs that change color with temperature. December day, cool, and the texture of coolness and heat even from the temp. A third nun ladles scum off the surface and tosses it into a bucket marked pig slop, while a novice scribbles notes on parchment. You're witnessing something quietly radical. The assumption, historically, is that monks ruled the brewing world. Monasteries brewed, monks drank, monks documented, monks, how do we say this nicely, branded the heck out of themselves. But here's the hoppy truth. Convents brewed too. A lot, and often better. You see, nuns didn't just replicate monastic recipes, they improved them. They added medicinal herbs, used cleaner water sources, and even experimented with early refrigeration by storing kegs in underground wells. Many convents had their own orchards and apothecaries, which meant nuns had access to flavorings and sanitation methods monks never bothered with. They weren't just brewing to drink. They were brewing to nourish travelers, treat patients, and occasionally to stay financially afloat in a world that wasn't exactly handing out business grants to women in habits. There's a fringe theory, by the way, that the first hopped beer in Germany, the innovation that separated gruit-based brews from what we now know as ale, was perfected not by a monk, but by a nun. The name whispered is often St. Hildegard, but we'll get to her soon. Right now, you watch one sister pour cloudy wort through a basket of dried herbs, yarrow, heather, a bit of wild rosemary. The smell is like a sleepy forest. She stirs slowly, as though the pace of the spoon could determine the peace of the day. The silence here isn't oppressive, it's focused. Brewing was a sacred act, part alchemy, part prayer. Each gesture could be a ritual. Stirring clockwise, covering the barrel with an embroidered cloth, whispering a psalm as yeast was pitched, just in case the Holy Spirit fancied a pint. Historians still argue whether the convents had official brew masters or if it was a communal task. Some suggest that elder sisters took on the role, passing knowledge like an oral grimoire from generation to generation. Others say it was the novice's job, perhaps because any mistakes could be blamed on inexperience. You notice that even in this sacred space, practicality reigns. One nun is patching a leaking cask with beeswax and linen. Another is arguing, gently, with the cook over whether barley left over from the brew should go to the chickens or the morning porridge. God will sort it, someone mutters. It's unclear whether she means the souls, the yeast, or the chickens. It's all surprisingly advanced. Wooden tubes direct steam away from the barrels. Stone floors are angled for drainage. There's even a sand pit where clay amphorae cool down overnight. An early form of temperature control. And here's the secret. The nuns weren't trying to impress anyone. They weren't selling labels. Their beer didn't have a logo. But it worked. It healed. It sustained. It occasionally knocked out the local bishop when he visited on feast days. You lean back against the warm stone and close your eyes. Outside, the village may still call this a man's world, but in here, under the soft hiss of simmering wort, you know you've stumbled into a quiet powerhouse. Tomorrow, you'll taste it. Tonight, you just breathe in the calm. Section 10. It's evening again now, the sun fading behind a halo of chimney smoke and lavender haze, and you find yourself invited to something unexpected. The silent tasting. You're led to a small hall off the main refectory, a long, low room with stone walls, a fire crackling at one end, and 3 narrow tables lined with clay cups. No one speaks. No one needs to. Tonight, the sisters are testing the final batch of their seasonal ale. Each woman enters, bows slightly at the door, and takes her place. A row of small cups waits before each seat, carefully numbered in charcoal. You're ushered to the end of the table, an honored guest, but expected to follow their rules. Taste, reflect, record. Not a word until the bell. The first sip is mild and bright, a bit grassy, with a thin foam that clings like lace to the side of the mug. The second is darker, notes of burnt caramel, clove, maybe a touch of honey. The second, an honored guest, notes of burnt caramel, clove, maybe a touch of honey. The third tastes like forest after rain. You can't explain it better than that. A sister to your left, perhaps the same one who crushed herbs this morning, writes in a slim leather book. 2 slightly bitter, pray for Brother Marcus's palate. The third sister down the row scribbles something and raises her brows theatrically. She's clearly amused. Another sister bites the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing, and just like that, the silence is joyful, not solemn. This, it turns out, is the sisterhood of the tasting room, a tradition kept without ceremony, without liturgy, but with great care. Historians still argue whether such formal tasting rituals existed in convents. There are no records of wine-style sommelier practices, no official scales, but scattered in margins of household manuscripts are little notes. Not sour this time, good color. Better than Hildy last Lent. And here, in this dimly lit room, it's easy to believe they did more than just brew. They evaluated. And they had opinions. You observe one sister sniffing her cup with a seriousness that would put modern brewers to shame. She sips. She frowns. She sips again. Then, carefully, she writes, 4. Confused. Pick a direction. It's collaboration. Each batch is both individual and collective. Brewed by one hand, shaped by many, just like the community itself. One elder nun, so old her habit seems to sag under its own history, raises a spoon to her lips and closes her eyes. She doesn't write anything. She just nods once, firmly. That batch is good. Final word. A novice at the far end spills a few drops and turns red as a pomegranate. Her neighbor passes a rag under the table without a glance. No scolding, just sisterhood. You sip your 5th cup. This one is surprising, sharp, herbal, almost lemony. It tastes like resolve, like standing your ground in a cold chapel while the bishop scowls and the beer still ferments behind him. And suddenly, it occurs to you that these tastings aren't just about flavor. They're about memory, emotion. They remember the batch brewed during the Great Frost, the one that cured a sick sister, the one that got the old abbot tipsy enough to fund a new well. This is oral history in a cup. Each sip a story, each brew a bookmark in the quiet, unfolding novel of their lives. Eventually, a bell rings. 3 soft chimes, and the room exhales. The sisters smile at one another, some sharing looks of triumph, others of quiet amusement. A few notes are tucked into sleeves to be added to the convent's tasting records, which you now know they absolutely keep, whether they admit it or not. One sister collects your notes, only to glance at your 3 tastes like a forest line and stifle a snort. She pats your shoulder and says gently, "That was nettle and elderflower." But yes, forest works too. Outside, the sky has dimmed to plum. Everything seems to be moving, and the sky has dimmed to plum. The fire pops behind you, and the taste of that lemony ale still lingers on your tongue like a hymn you can't quite remember the words to. In this room, without voices, without ego, you've witnessed something extraordinary, a beer culture built not on dominance or drama, but on trust, on skill passed hand to hand, palate to palate, across centuries. You leave the room quietly, your parchment tucked under your arm, and behind you, the sisters continue to sip. As she S Section 10. It's evening again now, the sun fading behind a halo of chimney smoke and lavender haze, and you find yourself invited to something unexpected. The silent tasting. You're led to a small hall off the main refectory, a long, low room with stone walls, a fire crackling at one end, and 3 narrow tables lined with clay cups. No one speaks, no one needs to. Tonight, the sisters are testing the final batch of their seasonal ale. Each woman enters, bows slightly at the door, and takes her place. A row of small cups waits before each seat, carefully numbered in charcoal. You're ushered to the end of the table, an honored guest, but expected to follow their rules. Taste, reflect, record. Not a word until the bell. The first sip is mild and bright, a bit grassy with a thin foam that clings like lace to the side of the mug. The second is darker, notes of burnt caramel, clove, maybe a touch of honey. The third tastes like forest after rain. You can't explain it better than that. A sister to your left, perhaps the same one who crushed herbs this morning, writes in a slim leather book, "Too slightly bitter. Pray for Brother Marcus's palate." The third sister down the row scribbles something and raises her brows theatrically. She's clearly amused. Another sister bites the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. And just like that, the silence is joyful, not solemn. This, it turns out, is the sisterhood of the tasting room, a tradition kept without ceremony, without liturgy, but with great care. Historians still argue whether such formal tasting rituals existed in convents. There are no records of Weinstein's sommelier practices, no official scales. But scattered in margins of household manuscripts are little notes. Not sour this time. Good color. Better than Hildy last Lent. And here, in this dimly lit room, it's easy to believe they did more than just brew. They evaluated. And they had opinions. You observe one sister sniffing her cup with a seriousness that would put modern brewers to shame. She sips. She frowns. She sips again. Then, carefully, she writes, 4, confused. Pick a direction. It's collaboration. Each batch is both individual and collective, brewed by one hand, shaped by many, just like the community itself. One elder nun, so old her habit seems to sag under its own history, raises a spoon to her lips and closes her eyes. She doesn't write anything. She just nods once, firmly. That batch is good. Final word. A novice at the far end spills a few drops and turns red as a pomegranate. Her neighbor passes a rag under the table without a glance. She drops her face. She lifts a hand to the table without no scolding, just sisterhood. You sip your fifth cup. This one is surprising. Sharp, herbal, almost lemony. It tastes like resolve, like standing your ground in a cold chapel while the bishop scowls and the beer still ferments behind him. And suddenly, it occurs to you that these tastings aren't just about flavor. They're about memory, emotion. They remember the batch brewed during the Great Frost, the one that cured a sick sister, the one that got the old abbot tipsy enough to fund a new well. This is oral history in a cup. Each sip a story. Each brew a bookmark in the quiet, unfolding novel of their lives. Eventually, a bell rings. 3 soft chimes. And the room exhales. The sisters smile at one another, some sharing looks of triumph, others of quiet amusement. A few notes are tucked into sleeves to be added to the convent's tasting records, which you now know they absolutely keep, whether they admit it or not. One sister collects your notes, only to glance at your 3 tastes like a forest line and stifle a snort. She pats your shoulder and says gently, "That was nettle and elderflower." But yes, forest works too. Outside, the sky has dimmed to plum, and a fire pops behind you, and the taste of that lemony ale still lingers on your tongue like a hymn you can't quite remember the words to. In this room, without voices, without ego, you've witnessed something extraordinary. A beer culture built not on dominance or drama, but on trust, on skill passed hand to hand, palate to palate, across centuries. You leave the room quietly, your parchment tucked under your arm. And behind you, the sisters continue to sip. At watching the world go by, something caught her eye. It wasn't so much its color or shape, but the way it was moving. She squinted to see if she could better understand what it was and where it was going, but it didn't help. As she continued to stare into the distance, she didn't understand why this uneasiness was building inside her body. As she sat watching the world go by, the afternoon light filters through high-arched windows as you duck into the infirmary, a quiet wing of the convent that smells of thyme, beeswax, and something earthy you can't quite name. At first glance, it looks like any medieval sick room. Neat cots, herbal bundles hanging from the beams, the faint rustle of linen as sisters tend to their patients. But then you spot them. Earthenware jugs, some sealed with wax, others open and half-poured. You're about to learn that the nuns didn't just brew to nourish or to sell. They also brewed to heal. A sister hands you a cup, not for sipping, but for sniffing. It's a cloudy pale ale infused with chamomile, marjoram, and a twist of lemon balm. The aroma is floral, calming, slightly medicinal. She gestures toward a sleeping patient in the next cot. He hasn't eaten in days, but this he can stomach. This is therapeutic beer. Historians often overlook the medicinal role of monastic brewing, but evidence suggests that nuns, in particular, experimented extensively with herb-infused ales. Unlike monks, who usually brewed for sustenance or celebration, nuns had a second mission: caregiving. And that meant figuring out which brews calmed the nerves, eased pain, lowered fevers, or soothed the soul. You're shown another brew, a deep amber concoction laced with ginger, nettle, and a faint touch of wild garlic. This one's for digestion. The sister pats her belly and raises an eyebrow. Strong, but effective, she says. Not all of it was science, of course. Some recipes sound downright alchemical. Boil 2 pigeons and steep the bones in ale with dried toadstool and fig bark. Let's just say results varied. But many of the brews worked. And that's because the nuns knew more than beer. They were trained in the properties of herbs, poultices, and tonics. Their herbalism manuals, often inherited from earlier abbacies, read like proto-pharmacology textbooks. Ailments were paired with cures, and often, those cures came with a bit of barley. You glance at one such manual. Handwritten, ink faded, corners curled. It includes a recipe for fever ale, a blend of yarrow, peppermint, and lightly soured grain beer. Beside it, in the margin, give warm, speak kindly. Sometimes the best medicine is attention. A patient coughs nearby. The sister pours him a small amount of dark, thick ale, almost a syrup, and adds a sprig of something green. You ask what it is. She replies, "Ale for grief. We give it after the burials. You sip it later yourself. It tastes like dark cherries, cinnamon, and rosemary. It tastes like remembering." There's growing modern interest in the healing traditions of nunneries. Breweries today are recreating ancient herbal ales, many inspired by convent journals and forgotten Latin side notes. Some even market their brews as healing beers, though thankfully no one's boiling pigeons anymore. Still, historians debate whether these medical beers were truly effective or just better than untreated water. Some argue the alcohol alone made the difference. Others suggest that the added herbs genuinely enhanced recovery. The truth probably lies in the overlap. Beer was cleaner than water, herbs had measurable effects, and the act of care itself had healing power. And let's not forget one key detail. These brews were often alcohol light. They weren't meant to sedate. They were meant to sustain, especially in times of plague, famine, or childbirth. Many sick rooms were sustained entirely by such low-strength ales, which carried calories, mild antiseptic properties, and flavor, even when food wouldn't stay down. You wander to a side shelf near the window, where jugs are labeled not with names, but with tiny symbols. A sun for energy, a teardrop for grief, a flower for rest. The nuns weren't running a pharmacy. They were crafting a sensory language of comfort. Outside, the bell for vespers begins to ring, soft and distant. The sister beside you begins sealing a jug of calming ale with wax and linen, her hands moving in practiced rhythm. She glances over at you. "Monks brew to celebrate," she says. "We brew for the hurting." You nod, and in that moment, surrounded by soft breath, quiet prayer, and the faint herbal tang of beer, you understand. Not all healing comes from medicine. Some comes from barley, water, herbs, and women who knew exactly what to do with them. Thing caught her eye. It wasn't so much its color or shape, but the way it was moving. She squinted to see if she could better understand what it was and where it was going, but it didn't help. As she continued to stare into the distance, she didn't understand why this uneasiness was building inside her body. Section 13. You return to the scriptorium as dusk settles, expecting more scrolls of grain counts or brew notes. But tonight, something different is waiting for you. A candle flickers beside an opened manuscript, and as you lean in, you catch a glimpse of something you didn't expect. A tiny, smirking cartoon of a nun holding a frothing mug. Welcome to the margins of the medieval mind, where beer slipped into the very ink of history. You're surrounded by parchment, some biblical, some botanical, some seemingly just doodles and divine distractions. But scattered throughout are drawings and notes that tell their own story. Hops tucked behind saints' ears, tiny casks sketched beside psalms, brewing jugs drawn with elaborate, loving detail. While most official brewing records came from monasteries, these playful marginalia suggest that convent scribes, likely nuns themselves, couldn't help but sneak in signs of their daily life. Because if you spend your mornings boiling wort and your afternoons copying psalms, the line between sacred and secular starts to blur. You trace one drawing in particular, a hop vine curling lazily across the corner of a hymn. It twines around the letters like ivy, ends in a fat little cone, so realistic you can almost smell the citrus bitterness. Next to it, a faint caption, Brewed on St. Martha's feast, when the heat broke and the yeast was kind. It's a little prayer, a little diary, a little nod to the rhythm of convent life. Historians still argue whether nuns were the ones adding these illustrations, or if traveling scribes passed through and amused themselves between sermons. But given the details, the herbs, the brewing jokes, the familiarity, it's clear that whoever drew them knew beer. One page includes a mock recipe disguised as a psalm. Yeast maketh glad the heart, but overboil leadeth to wrath. Blessed is she who skimmeth well, for her ale shall not be cloudy. Amen. Another shows a nun holding a mug aloft, while a monk sulks in the corner. A cheeky ribbon above their heads reads, "Thine hath more head. You nearly spit out your drink." What you're seeing isn't just humor. It's evidence of presence, of identity, of joy tucked into the creases of duty. Most medieval records, particularly those that survived wars, reforms, and inquisitions, focused on what was important: theology, land ownership, doctrinal debates. But in these margins, you glimpse the lives of women who brewed, tended, laughed, and left a trace, and sometimes those traces were even in the ink itself. You examine a darker page, one with slightly glossy text. A sister beside you lifts it gently toward the candlelight and explains, "Ink made with boiled ale. It lasts longer on damp parchment." Wait, what? Yes, apparently in times when wine or gall was unavailable, some convents substituted beer, particularly darker, more viscous batches, to make ink. The sugar helped bind the pigment. The alcohol slowed spoilage. You sniff the page. There's no scent now, but the fact lingers. Beer may have literally helped write history. It's speculative, sure, but plausible. The ingredients overlap. And if you're a nun in charge of both brewing and copying texts, you're going to get creative. Who else would think, "Today's brew went sideways, let's turn it into psalms"? You flip to another volume. This one is an herbal compendium, but in the corner is a rough sketch of a brewing station. Fire, kettle, barrels. A note underneath reads, "For Sister Gertrude, who stirs as if chased by devils." It's affectionate, it's alive, and it shows that brewing wasn't just work, it was identity. You sit for a moment longer, fingers smudged faintly with ink. The candle pops as wax meets wick, and shadows flicker across the walls. Somewhere outside, a donkey brays, and someone drops a bucket. Inside this chamber of words, the silence is thick with memory. You think of the women who copied texts by day and brewed beer by night, who infused scripture with scent, who wrapped their lives, grain, yeast, labor, into the books we now treat like relics. The monks may have had libraries, but the nuns, they had margins that whispered. Whisper. Section 14. Outside, the wind shifts. It carries a faint bite now, autumn tipping toward winter, and you follow it through the convent's rear corridor, where the walls thicken and the windows grow smaller. The air feels older here, denser. You descend a few uneven stone steps and enter the cellar vaults. It smells like damp stone, old yeast, and something smoky. You know this scent. It's survival. Because this is where the sisters hid during the plague, and where the beer may have saved them. The Black Death hit Europe in waves, and with each one came panic, collapse, and the slow unraveling of certainty. Monasteries, densely populated, highly connected, were hit hard. In some, entire orders vanished in a season, but some convents, they endured. Not untouched, but less devastated. Why? Partly it was isolation. Convents tended to be smaller, more cloistered, with fewer visitors. But there's another theory, whispered by historians, brewed in speculation. The beer helped. You pause beside a cask so large it seems older than the walls around it. A faint symbol is carved into its lid, a bundle of rosemary crossed with a barley stalk. A plague batch. During times of illness, nuns brewed special ales, lower in alcohol, higher in herb content. and carefully controlled. Yarrow, sage, horehound, and elderberry, ingredients now known for antiviral or antiseptic qualities, were added not for flavor, but survival. And just as importantly, these ales were safer than water. The sister guiding you places her hand on a ledger bound in goatskin. 22 of us remained, she says, voice low. We buried 7. But we continued. She opens the book. The pages list names, brews, feast days, and hauntingly notes in the margins, Sister Elspeth fevered, given nettle brew, no bread, replaced with oat ale, death count stayed low, keep boiling longer. It's not a medical textbook, but it reads like one. It's a log of tactical brewing under siege. Historians still debate the effectiveness of plague-era beer. Was it truly medicinal, or just less deadly than unfiltered water? But again, the answer may lie in the middle. It was safe, it was hydrating, and it gave the sisters something to do, a structure, a sense of control when the world unraveled. You follow her deeper into the vault, where torches now flicker against soot-lit glass ceilings. A room here once served as quarantine. The walls are marked with crosses, but there's a tiny shelf built into the stone, lined with mugs. Even here they brewed, even here they drank, even here they offered comfort in the form of warm, bitter hope. You stop beside a barrel marked St. Veronica. The sister explains that this was the last plague batch brewed before the convent closed its gates for good in 1351. It was made with rosemary, bitter orange peel, and holy water blessed 3 times. They called it Vale Ale. It was reserved only for the dying. You sip a small sample. The taste is sharp, herbal, unfamiliar, but it's also grounding, like standing barefoot on frozen earth and feeling, somehow, safe. The sister leans close. We do not brew that one unless we must. And with that, she leads you back into the light. Outside, the convent seems unchanged. A goat bleaks. Someone is turning soil in the herb garden. But below, you now know, history was brewed under pressure. What the monks recorded in scrolls, the nuns inscribed in fermentation and resilience. Their beer didn't just nourish, it resisted, it remembered, and it endured. Section 15. You awaken to the sound of hooves clopping on cobbles, and a voice shouting Latin too fast for your sleepy brain. Something about inventory, or blessings, or maybe overdue tithes. Whatever it is, it draws you toward the front of the convent, where change has arrived in the form of a courier on a dust-streaked horse, scroll in hand, frown on face. The Reformation has begun to ripple outward, and it's about to spill into the sisters' brew. This isn't just about theology anymore. It's about ownership, control, and who gets to exist. The nun who takes the scroll reads it carefully, nodding once, her face unreadable. You glance over her shoulder and spot the words: suppression, seizure, dissolution. You've entered the endgame. Across Europe, convents like this one are closing. Some are quietly shuttered by local lords. Others are ransacked by mobs inspired by new Protestant zeal. In England, Henry VIII's sweeping dissolution didn't just target monasteries. It also swallowed up nunneries, along with their gardens, their apothecaries, and their breweries. The sister rolls up the scroll with a snap and hands it off to another without a word. Inside, things move faster now. Brewing tools are packed, jugs are hidden. Recipes never written in official ledgers are whispered one final time to novices, passed like prayer beads. Historians still argue whether any original Nuns beer recipes survived. Some claim they were absorbed into local tavern traditions. Others believe they were simply lost, extinguished like candle smoke in a draft. But hints remain: a spiced ale in Belgium, with no male monastic origin, a strangely floral table beer in Austria, still brewed on St. Hildegard's feast day. Back in the convent, you watch as a sister carefully unhooks a ladle from its place above the hearth. She turns it in her hands, considering. Then, with a decisive breath, she wraps it in linen and tucks it into a satchel. Legacy, in a spoon. They don't fight. They don't resist. They prepare. Some of the younger nuns will be taken in by noble families. Others will go to distant abbeys, if those remain. But the brew house? It will be boarded up. The kettles will be stripped for copper. The barrels will be seized by someone who doesn't know how long to steep the nettle or when the yeast starts to sing. You step into the scriptorium one last time. It's already half emptied. A few texts remain, stacked haphazardly. You pull one at random and find a single line scrawled at the bottom in a novice's shaky hand. We brewed as well as we prayed. Maybe better? You smile, then fold the page and slide it carefully between the covers of your journal. Because someone has to remember. And here's the strange thing. While the monk beer legacy flourished, mass-produced, mass-marketed, abbey labels intact, the nun's contribution vanished. Not because it was lesser, but because it didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't written large. It was lived small and lived well. A few centuries later, brewing will become masculine again, industrialized, commodified, wrapped in frothy nationalism. The idea of women brewers will seem novel, quaint, or even controversial. And yet, here you are, walking through a convent that once produced the most balanced, carefully crafted, lovingly spiced ales in the land. Without a label, without a name, but with precision, care, and something very close to genius. As you step out into the fading afternoon light, the final batch is being bottled. Not for sale, not even for celebration, just to remember. One cask will be buried under the garden, another will go to a neighboring convent, a third will be given to a kindly tavern keeper who has always paid fairly. And the last, well, the sisters gather one last time for a silent tasting. Same fire, same cups, but this time, there's a weight to it. A goodbye. You sip yours slowly, letting it linger. It tastes of rosemary, burnt honey, and something you can't quite name. Loss, maybe. Or maybe legacy. Section 16. You return to the garden one last time, walking slowly along the edge of the cloister wall, where ivy weaves through cracked stone. A few bees linger over the last of the chamomile, and you can hear the soft creak of wooden doors as the convent prepares for quiet that may stretch into years. The brew house is empty now. No bubbling kettles, no clink of ladles, no quiet murmurs over herbal ratios. Just the faintest echo of movement, as if the stones themselves still remember what was once stirred here. You find a small bench where you sat days ago, back when this was still a place of motion and scent and steam. It hasn't changed, but everything else has. You sip the final cup given to you, a leftover from the last batch. It's mellow now, aged slightly in the cool air with notes of thyme and toasted grain. It's not the best one you've had here, but it tastes final, honest, like the last line of a story that's been written in steam and barley. And so, you remember. You remember the sister who stirred with perfect timing, never glancing at the hourglass. The one who labeled her barrels with saints and feelings. The elder who tasted like she was praying. The novice who spilled wort and learned to laugh anyway. You remember how beer here was never about power. It was about presence. In a world that kept shrinking the definition of what women could do, these nuns kept expanding it, silently, patiently, through every perfected batch, not with declarations, but with decisions, with craft, with care. Historians may keep arguing, the records may stay quiet, the bottles may stay buried in time, but somewhere, the yeast remembers. And now, so do you. The wind picks up slightly and a door creaks behind you, just enough to remind you you're not quite alone. Perhaps one sister is still tidying, or perhaps it's the air itself paying homage. You drink the last sip. It's sweet. Then, softly, the garden exhales. And now, let's slow everything down. You lean back on that old bench, the stone warm behind your shoulders, the scent of rosemary and wood smoke still dancing on the edges of your memory. The bustle of the brew house is long gone, replaced by a hush so soft it might be silence, or maybe just peace. Let your breath follow the rhythm of a quiet evening, in and out. Again, slower now. Let your thoughts soften at the edges. You can still feel the shape of the mug in your hand, the weight of it, the warmth. You remember the way the candlelight danced along the clay, the gentle laughter in the tasting room, the way even the yeast seemed to hum when the balance was just right. These women, their work, their wisdom, their winks and rituals, didn't vanish. They steeped themselves into history, flavor by flavor. Their story lives in every slow pour, every herbal note, every gentle moment shared over a cup. You carry it now. So wherever you are, in your bed, on your couch, wherever sleep finds you, let the weight of this story settle around you like a soft wool blanket. Safe, rounded, a little bittersweet, and very, very human. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the flicker of the hearth fade into the distance. Let the taste of rosemary and thyme linger on your tongue. You're safe here. You're full of quiet stories. And it's okay to rest now. Sleep well, dream deep, and maybe tomorrow raise a glass to someone who brewed better, not louder. Sweet dreams. Section 2. You wake to the smell of roasted grain wafting through the cloister, and your eyes blink open beneath the arched stone ceiling of the guest house. Morning light slants through stained glass, painting warm reds and ambers across your blanket. You stretch, groggy and pleasantly disoriented, like someone who's accidentally slept in a place more holy than expected. The nuns are already up, of course. Supplication even begins to smell like roast. Your head feels better. Your job sensitive in spite of the sun. You hear the creak of buckets, the soft murmur of psalms, and the familiar clatter of activity near the brewery. The day begins early here, not just for prayer, but because beer waits for no one. Fermentation is a fickle beast. You shuffle back toward the brewing house, drawn again to that warm, yeasty hum. A novice greets you with a lopsided smile, and a mug already half full of something frothy and golden. You sip, and the world pauses. It's smooth, bitter in a balanced way, nutty but floral, not the heavy, bread-thick brew monks often made for fasting. This is clean, intentional, and weirdly modern. Holy water, the novice says, smirking. And that's no joke. You glance at the barrels lined against the wall and realize something crucial. The nuns had better access to fresh, clean water than most communities in medieval Europe. In the stables, why? Because unlike some monasteries built high on rugged outcrops for isolation, convents were often placed near towns. This meant access to wells, rivers, and even municipal aqueducts, if you were lucky enough to live in a Roman-plumbed ghost of a city. The sisters filtered their water through layers of crushed charcoal, moss, and cloth. Some boiled it, some blessed it, and some, more practically, just used the freshest source available that didn't already smell like a duck died in it. It sounds obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. Historians still argue whether this access to cleaner water gave nun-brewed beers a measurable quality edge, or if it was just luck and a good nose. Either way, it's undeniable that their beers spoiled less, fermented more predictably, and tasted far more consistent over time. That's half the brewing battle won. You step around a row of barrels marked with tiny sigils, each identifying the brew's purpose. One for meals, one for travelers, one for medicinal uses, and yes, one for celebration days that you suspect has a bit more of a kick than the others. In the corner, an older nun is grinding herbs with a pestle the size of a rolling pin. Her hands move with muscle memory, her fingers dusted in what looks like dried thyme and sage. She nods to the wall behind her. Shelves filled with bundles of lavender, coriander seed, mugwort, even dried orange peel, imported at great cost from Italy, likely smuggled in under the guise of religious necessity. Here's where it gets weirdly impressive. The convent's herbarium wasn't just decorative. It served as a full apothecary, and many of those same herbs went directly into their beer, not just for taste, but for preservation. Mugwort acted like a mild antiseptic. Juniper berries discouraged spoilage. Even chamomile, typically reserved for soothing teas, found its way into a calming evening brew for aging sisters. A few of these ingredients weren't even allowed in monastic brews due to stricter Benedictine rules. But the nuns? They weren't always under the same surveillance. And while monks were bound to rigid recipes, nuns experimented quietly in the shadows. If a batch worked, it stayed. If not, it vanished faster than a bishop's promise. You note that the nuns used closed clay fermenters, likely to reduce contamination, and smaller batch sizes than the monasteries. More control, more finesse. While monks brewed in quantity, sisters brewed for quality. Oh, and about those tools, the nuns' brewing chambers had better ventilation. And, brace yourself, there's evidence they used linen-wrapped staves dipped in beeswax to stir the wort without introducing bacteria. Monks often reused wooden paddles that turned into little moldy biographies of past batches. Quaint, but gross. As you sip a second mug, warm and citrusy this time, you hear the clang of a bell and pause. The sisters begin their silent meal. You peek in, a small loaf of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and beside each plate, a modest wooden cup of beer. Milder than your mug, likely with less alcohol, but still unmistakably crafted. Beer was food, liquid bread, and the nuns treated it as such, with reverence but not drama. In the shadowy corners of the dining hall, you spot an alcove with dusty records. Parchments, logs, scribbles of brew times, harvest cycles, prayers to Saint Bridget, patroness of both healing and brewing, naturally. The nuns had systematized their process in ways that modern microbreweries might admire. One particular page catches your eye. It's a simple chart. Grain types, verses, brew outcomes. Notes on taste, longevity, and acidity. Next to it, a tiny sketch of a smiling sun and the words barley sprouted 3 days after St. Agatha's feast. Always a good sign. There's no ego in these records, no signatures, just a quiet devotion to process. And you begin to realize something. While monks brewed to sustain communities and often for trade, nuns brewed out of necessity, but also with a kind of artistic joy. Their batches were smaller, more thoughtful, and, yes, frequently better. You exhale still holding the cup. The fire crackles. The yeast bubbles softly in a nearby barrel. And all around you, the convent continues to hum, not with chants, but with the rhythm of a well-run brewery. The day ripens as you walk back through the cloister garden, mug still warm in your hand, breath fogging in the crisp late morning air. Bees wobble lazily between thyme flowers. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls the hour, and you can't help but chuckle at the irony. Somewhere out there, monks are bottling their original abbey ale, grinning behind barrels that probably owe more to nun labor than any divine male intervention. And that brings us to one nun in particular. You round a corner, and there she is. Not in person, obviously, but painted in rich ochres on a crumbling mural. Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Her fingers are ink-stained. Her eyes almost sparkle with that familiar, I'm about to prove you wrong. Twinkle. If brewing had saints outside marketing, she'd be on the label. Let's set the scene. It's the 12th century. You're in the Rhineland. Hildegard is running a Benedictine convent, writing books on medicine, philosophy, and theology. She's composing music, literal celestial bangers that still echo through Gothic cathedrals. And, just casually, she's writing Physica, a sprawling text on natural science that includes one little detail that changed beer forever. She writes about hops. Now, hops weren't new. People had tossed them in beer occasionally, accidentally even. But Hildegard is the first to document their medicinal use in brewing. She noted their preservative quality. She said they were healing to the melancholy, which, if you've ever had a good Pilsner at the end of a bad day, feels about right. Historians still argue whether she was the true originator of hopped beer or simply the first to write it down. Some claim she just inherited folk wisdom. Others insist she pioneered something revolutionary. Either way, her words kicked off a cascade. Suddenly, beer didn't have to spoil after a week. Suddenly, you could export it, age it, sell it. But here's the fun twist. Monks are the ones who ran with it publicly. Their abbeys, often wealthier and better connected, picked up Hildegard's writings and, surprise, started producing more stable beer. Guess who didn't get credited? Yep. Back in your convent, you notice a battered scroll of Physica, tucked on a dusty shelf near the herb rack. A sister nods toward it like it's a treasured recipe card. We use her ratios for bittering, she says, almost shyly. You ask how long they followed Hildegard's model. About 800 years, she deadpans. There's a common assumption that medieval beer was thick, sweet, and vaguely poisonous. But Hildegard's hops began to change that. They cut through the sweetness, balanced the flavors, helped prevent spoilage, and introduced that clean, dry aftertaste we associate with modern ale. Still, it wasn't just about flavor. There's a theory, fringe but fun, that convents started to experiment with hops first because they had access to herbalists and medicinal gardens. Monasteries were larger, more administrative. Convents were more hands-on. They grew what they used. And when hops began to flourish in nearby fields, they were just another bitter flower. Until a curious nun asked, "What if we steep it?" That spirit of experimentation set convent brewing apart. Nuns weren't chained to massive production. They brewed for the community, not the kingdom. And that meant they had room to play. Room to taste. You trail your fingers along the edge of a stone basin where dried hop vines have curled in on themselves, brittle but still fragrant. The sister beside you plucks a cone, crushes it gently in her palm, and hands it to you. You smell lemon, pine, earth. It's oddly hypnotic. Too much and it bites, she says. Just enough and it sings. It's that philosophy, restraint, balance, intuition, that permeates every corner of the convent's brewing. Monks wrote down rules. Nuns memorized nuances. The result? Beers that were subtle, layered, almost emotional. In a world where brewing was seen as sweaty work, it's quietly thrilling to realize how intellectual it could be in the hands of these women. Brewing here wasn't just cooking. It was chemistry, theology, medicine, and yes, sometimes divine accident. A gentle breeze brushes through the herbs hanging overhead. An officer stood by the ship. A medical breeze brushes through the herbs hanging overhead. Your cup is empty again. A sister refills it without asking. This one's darker, a malt-forward amber ale, hints of plum and clove. As you sip, you remember something you once read in a museum. The early history of beer is written in the margins. You hadn't understood it until now. Hildegard's margin notes, her herb lists, her advice about hops. That's where this begins. And in every quiet convent like this one, her spirit lingers, not just in prayer or song, but in every careful swirl of wort. You lean back against the warm stones of the brew house, watching the sisters move like clockwork. Measured, efficient, serene. The convent may be cloistered, but its influence flows far beyond these walls. In your cup, in your mind, in the bitterness that lingers, just enough to make you crave another sip. By now, you've tasted at least 3 beers. You've wandered past herbs you can't pronounce. You've nodded respectfully to a saint who basically invented the modern IPA. And yet, the world beyond these convent walls still has no idea any of this happened. So how did history forget? You step into the convent's outer courtyard, where market stalls once stood beneath simple linen canopies. The stones are cracked now, moss pushing up between them, but once, centuries ago, this place was alive with barter. Baskets of dried grain, clay jugs of dark, foamy ale, and in the center, a nun in sturdy sandals negotiating with a butcher over the price of spent grain for pig slop. You're witnessing a scene repeated in dozens, maybe hundreds of convents across Europe. These nuns weren't just cloistered brewers, they were also entrepreneurs. But history didn't give them that title. Instead, it gave them a term soaked in sexism and suspicion: alewives. The term alewife originally just meant a woman who brewed beer and sold it from her home. In towns and villages, that was often the case. Widows, wives, daughters, who took up the family brew kettle and turned barley into bread. You can drink. But as centuries passed, the term picked up a sneer. Caricatures appeared in woodcuts, grizzled women with pointy hats, crooked noses, and sometimes cats. Yes, that stereotype. Add a broom, and suddenly you're one cauldron away from a witch hunt. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Convent nuns were not alewives in the public imagination, but functionally, they kind of were. They brewed, they sold to travelers, they paid taxes. Some convents even kept brewing guild licenses, but because they wore habits, not aprons, they slipped under the cultural radar. Historians still argue whether this invisibility helped preserve their brewing or buried it under monk-branded history. Some claim that their religious affiliation protected their reputations. Others argue it erased them. After all, monks had scribes. They documented every foamy victory. Nuns, not so much. Their records were sparse, their illustrations delicate. No chest-thumping tales of out-drinking Vikings, just quiet excellence. You watch as 2 sisters haul a small barrel toward the front gate. Not to a tavern, not to a king, just to a traveling merchant, in need of a drink, and maybe a prayer. The ale they're carrying is light, easy, meant for mid-journey sipping. It's not meant to conquer markets. It's meant to serve. And that's part of the magic. Where monks brewed with a mind toward trade, expanding influence, building revenue, many convents brewed for relational exchange. Their beer wasn't a product. It was a gesture. Payment for help, hospitality for guests, even an apology for a late tithe. One record from 14th century Brabant lists a nun-led convent brewing over 3,000 gallons a year. That's not just charity, that's scale. But their influence wasn't always welcome. In some towns, monks and their supporters accused convents of overstepping. Brewing was too commercial, they argued, unbecoming of sisters. In truth, it was likely competition talking. And so, whispers started. Some accused the nuns of using unclean methods. Others suggested the presence of male workers in convent breweries was improper, even immoral. The nuns responded with silence, or maybe sass. One convent in Flanders reportedly hosted a local bishop with a celebration ale so strong he had to be carried out. The record ends with the line, "He gave no further complaints." As you pass the old gate, you notice symbols etched into the arch: wheat, water, flame. Brewing wasn't secret. It was sacred. And yet, unlike the grand abbey breweries with their bells and painted ceilings, the convents brewed in modest buildings with few signs of status. Their humility became their invisibility. And that, perhaps, is the most poetic irony. While monks added abbey crests to labels that still exist today, the nuns let the beer speak for itself. No slogans, no scrolls, just the soft clink of clay mugs behind garden walls. You sit on a bench carved from elm and sip a low-alcohol table beer used daily by nuns, guests, and even children. It's tart, bright, slightly cloudy, somehow refreshing and grounding at once. This is not a brew made for profit, it's made for presence. And for a moment, you wonder what would have happened if the world had valued these women not just for their vows, but for their craft. If alewife had become a term of respect. If beer schools taught about both robes brown and black, monk and nun. But then again, maybe it's better this way. Maybe there's something deliciously subversive about drinking history's forgotten beer, one silent, bittersweet mug at a time. The bell tolls again, the sun dips lower, and the smell of wort brewing for tomorrow's batch rises from behind you, warm and sweet. You're not just in a convent. The restaurant serves up the most bottomless batch, bigger than the tunnel. One cot. You're in a legacy. Section 5. The sun is beginning to slip down past the stone walls, gilding the courtyard in a soft amber glow. Perfect lighting, you suspect, for evaluating the clarity of beer, which is exactly what's happening now. You're seated on a long wooden bench under a woven canopy of grapevines, watching as three sisters in identical habits hold clay mugs up to the light. No words are exchanged, just nods, glances, and the faintest tilt of an eyebrow. A fourth sister jots notes in a little leather-bound book. You're witnessing the convent tasting panel, and it's not just for fun. Beer was serious business here. You may have imagined medieval convents as places of prayer and weaving and maybe the occasional scriptorium project. But right now, you're learning about ledgers, specifically the kind that track gallons brewed, grains bought, and mugs sold. Because brewing wasn't just about hospitality, it was also one of the few reliable sources of income for nuns. See, many convents were chronically underfunded. Unlike monasteries, which often had powerful patrons, extensive land grants, and revenue from pilgrimages, convents had to hustle. Literally. They spun cloth, they grew herbs, they taught Latin. But beer? Beer sold, especially when it was better than what the monks were offering. Beer became so popular that one convent even put its money into a second monastery listed on the 10-cent notice. So what did the monastery do? It spent billions and billions trying to figure out how to sell beer. Beer sold, especially when it was better than what the monks were offering. And beer did not pay well. Convent beer was biting and selling. It tasted excellent. It had literary quality. It was intended for cultural expression. And you peek over the scribe's shoulder. The ledger is in neat Latin, but even your rusty schoolboy phrases catch the essentials. How many barrels brewed this month? How many gifted to travelers? How many sold at half price to the infirmary down the road? One convent in Germany even included a cheeky margin note next to its delivery log. The Brothers of St. Anton requested more ale. We reminded them we are not their brewery. Cold. But it wasn't just sales that gave convents an edge. It was scale and consistency. Brewing in smaller batches meant nuns could control variables that often derailed larger monastic operations: humidity, yeast infections, the microbial kind, and grain spoilage. Their beers didn't just taste better, they also lasted longer, traveled better, and, surprisingly, got fewer complaints. Historians still argue whether the success of nunneries in brewing led to actual economic threats for local monks. Some say the overlap was minimal. Others cite documented tensions between abbeys and convents over ale territories. Yes, that was a thing. You sit back and sip a newly poured mug. This one is surprisingly sour, with hints of wild plum and something herbal you can't quite name. A nun catches your puzzled look and offers a whisper. Bog myrtle. The starter says, I do not know, but the second taste of a beer will certainly bring me back. This one does have whisper. Bog myrtle. You nod like you totally know what that is. She smiles and turns back to the group. The tasting continues, no one raising their voice, no one competing. There's a kind of meditative rhythm to it, a peaceful seriousness. And it's in this moment that you realize this isn't just about economics. It's about craft. These women are artisans. They don't brag, they don't brand, but their knowledge is deep, earned, tested by centuries of repetition, scarcity, and necessity. Their beer is their voice. Back inside the brew house, you spot what looks like a prayer board, but is, in fact, the brew schedule. Marked with saints' days, moon phases, and tiny illustrations of barley heads, it lays out a calendar that's equal parts religious and logistical. Brew on Fridays, taste on Tuesdays, rest on Sundays, never brew on St. Jude's Day. Apparently, the yeast always misbehaves. In one corner, a young novice, maybe 14, maybe 15, is practicing her first boil. A senior sister hovers close, but says nothing unless asked. The kettle hisses. The girl adds herbs, hesitates, then grabs a pinch more. Her brow furrows. The elder nods once, approvingly. No gold stars, no applause, just the slow building of mastery. You think about how this training, this quiet mentorship, passed through generations like a secret code, not written in textbooks, but brewed in real time. Another bell tolls. Evening vespers. The sisters drift toward the chapel, their sandals whispering against the stone. One stays behind just long enough to stoke the fire under a gently simmering wort before disappearing through an arched door. You remain a moment longer, alone with the smell of barley and sweet smoke. What began as a humble household chore became a sacred ritual. Some sort of barley smoke? What began as survival became strategy, and what began as necessity became unmistakably excellence. No fancy marketing, no illuminated manuscripts, just beer that worked. And the women who knew exactly how to make it. You lift your mug one more time. To them. Section 6. You sleep deeply that night, your dreams awash in the scents of yeast and wildflowers, your mind spinning just slightly. Whether from the beer or the history, it's hard to say. When morning comes, you rise with the convent, joining the sisters for a simple breakfast, barley porridge, dried apples, and of course, a small mug of table beer. Because, remember, beer wasn't a vice here. It was nutrition. Outside the convent walls, however, the picture looked quite different. The wider world still saw brewing as men's work, or, when done by women, something suspect. But in this pocket of calm, nuns had already found a loophole in gendered expectations. They weren't women in the marketplace sense, they were holy. Tucked behind veils, their skills often went unchallenged, until they started getting too successful. You spend the morning in the brew house again, watching the yeast rise and fall like a sleepy ocean. Today's batch is particularly fragrant. Lavender and coriander steep in the warm vapor, a scent so soothing it could be bottled as incense. Fermentation and feminism, the sister beside you says with a faint grin, wiping her hands on her robe. You glance over. Did she just say that? She did. She points to the bubbling cask. Yeast is like any woman. Give her the right environment, and she'll rise. You nearly choke on your sip, but she's right. Yeast needs warmth, stability, food, and space. And in the convent, it got all of that. Unlike the chaotic, sprawling monasteries where massive batches were brewed in bulk for festivals, trade, or tax purposes, convents were quieter, more precise. Their yeast strains, often kept alive in cloth-wrapped jars or honeyed starters, were stable across generations. Historians still argue whether these convent yeast strains directly influenced modern brewing lineages. Some say yes, pointing to persistent strains in regional farmhouse brews. Others claim the connection was lost when industrial brewing took over. But in whispered corners of brewing forums, there are those who still chase the nun yeast flavor. Floral, fast, and weirdly resilient. You follow a sister to a smaller room off the main brew house. This is their library, though not of books. It's where starter cultures are kept in ceramic jars sealed with beeswax and linen. Some have initials etched into the clay, others are tagged with nothing more than saint names. St. Apollonia's yeast is fast and sweet. St. Margaret's is spicy. St. Scholastica's? Apparently temperamental. Great in spring, terrible in Lent. This is yeast as legacy. Cultures passed down like rosaries, through whispered instructions and careful storage. And the sisters knew their microbes. They didn't call it Saccharomyces cerevisiae, of course. They called it the bloom, or the mother, or God's foam, which sounds like a craft beer you'd definitely buy at a farmer's market in Portland. But make no mistake, these women were doing proto-microbiology before microscopes existed. They could spot a contaminated batch by smell alone. They adjusted mash temperatures with nothing but fire, intuition, and the slow pour of cold water from clay jugs. They tracked fermentation speed by the pitch of bubbles in sealed crocks. And unlike many monastic brewers who took pride in size, nuns took pride in control. They weren't just brewing, they were cultivating. Back in the main room, you watch as a sister opens a barrel, scoops out a foamy ladleful, and tests it on a smooth stone plate. She tilts it back and forth, nodding at the cling and clarity. You're not entirely sure what she's seeing, but she is, and you realize again how deep the knowledge runs. Brewing offered something rare to these women, a craft that was physical and intellectual. It was science and art. It allowed them to make decisions, solve problems, and develop something that tangibly served their community. In a world that often saw women as decorative, passive, or silent, beer gave them agency. One scholar called convent brewing a quiet rebellion by the kettle, and you can see it now, clear as the steam rising into the morning light. A nun leans over the barrel, inhaling. "Almost ready," she murmurs, then adds with a grin, "It's got kick." You taste it again, and yes, beneath the floral surface, there's strength. Not just in the brew, but in the hands that made it. Outside, the town is waking up. Bells chime, merchants shout, horses clatter past. Inside, the convent remains serene, but you know better now. Behind this calm is precision, pride, power, and a whole lot of yeast. Section 7. The midday sun warms the stones of the cloister, casting sharp-edged shadows across the herb garden as you make your way toward a side courtyard. You're headed somewhere special today, somewhere that tells a different side of the story. A doorway in the stone wall creaks open to reveal a low-ceilinged chamber, its walls blackened from centuries of heat. A tangle of copper coils snakes across the room, and kettles bubble over open flames. No prayers here, only bubbling, boiling, and the occasional hiss of escaping steam. Welcome to the Nun Lab, or at least the closest medieval equivalent. This is where the real nerding out happened. Not just brewing, but testing, tinkering, tweaking. These weren't just nuns with ladles, they were early chemists, even if they'd never heard the word. At the far end of the room, a sister in a soot-streaked habit is tending to 3 different fermentation jars. Each is covered with linen and marked with symbols, one with barley, one with rye, one with a mystery mix that smells faintly like honey and damp roses. She eyes the bubbles with the same scrutiny you'd expect from a modern scientist reading data on a screen. You lean in, watching as she carefully removes a cloth. Steam rises, thick and fragrant. "This one's new," she says. "Sprouted grains. Lower temperature. Longer soak." You ask why she's trying something different. Her answer? Because yesterday's batch was too loud. And that's when it hits you. These women weren't just copying monk recipes. They were building their own database, one experiment at a time. You might expect monks to keep cleaner records. And they did. Pages of illuminated brewing guides with careful measurements and Latin diagrams. But often, those texts were copied by rote. The nuns, meanwhile, brewed by feel. They worked in smaller volumes, which meant failure wasn't catastrophic. It was educational. Try a new herb, steep it longer, stir it faster, see what happens. Historians still argue whether this made them better brewers overall. Some say yes, their flexibility allowed for more responsive brewing. Others claim it led to inconsistency. But here, in the chamber, you taste the difference. This is beer made by intuition, and you know what else? It's cleaner, quite literally. While some monks were still tossing barley mash into open troughs where rats occasionally sampled the goods, nuns had stricter sanitation rituals. Their fermenting vessels were scrubbed with lye soap and rinsed with vinegar. Wooden spoons were boiled, dried, and hung on racks above clean ash beds. Even the cooling cloths were rotated daily, bleached with sun, not magic. This wasn't just fastidiousness, it was necessity. Monks had more room for error, larger budgets, wider reputations. If a batch went bad, they could hide it in the cellar and forget it. But convents? A ruined brew could mean less food, fewer trade goods, and possibly no income that month. So, they got it right. You follow another sister to a dark corner of the lab where a row of small bottles glows in filtered sunlight. Each contains a slightly different liquid, some pale gold, some rich amber, some nearly black. Tied to each is a tag marked with dates and tiny initials. Yeast variants, she says. Sister Madeline's is sweet. Sister Lucia's sour. We mix them. You ask how they know which one to use. She shrugs. Depends what we're praying for. Modern brewers might scoff, but what you're seeing is the earliest form of blended yeast management. Instead of isolating one strain, the nuns used multiple types depending on need, season, and batch size, like chefs with spice racks. You ask if they've ever written it all down. Some, but mostly, she taps her temple. Here. It's easy to romanticize this, to imagine genius hidden in shadow. But don't forget, this was hard, hot, relentless work. Brewing required hauling heavy kettles, endless stirring, and long hours standing barefoot on stone floors slick with steam and grain. The difference? These women chose to master it, not for glory, not even for money, but because it mattered. You catch one sister scraping a spoon across the edge of a boiling pot, lifting a pale foam to her lips. She tastes. She nods. She whispers a blessing, half prayer, half quality control. And as you sit down on a small stool in the corner, the room humming with heat and motion, it becomes clear. The nuns weren't just brewers. They were technologists. Not with silicon and circuits, but with herbs, instincts, and inherited wisdom. They built systems. They passed them on. And they adapted, quietly, brilliantly, each generation. You exhale. The steam wraps around you like a shawl, and for a moment you feel the rhythm of centuries pulsing beneath your feet. It smells like rosemary, it tastes like honey, and it's stronger than anything the monks ever brewed.